Thank you everyone for coming. It's been an amazing day today. Such a broad spectrum of thoughtful and considerate thinkers and speakers. It's really been amazing. And we were talking down in the courtyard, and I was saying that Felix would have gotten such a kick out of this this day. I think that he would have been incredibly engaged, I think super critical of what was being said, and utilizing the things that were being said, probably arguing with some of it, and also embracing a lot of the things that were said, and most likely in the kind of typical way of Felix, modestly humbled by the consideration and the seriousness in which people were taking him, because these are consideration and seriousness are aspects of Felix's personality that were quite pronounced for those of us who were lucky enough to know him. I just want to say that, you know, as an artist, as a fellow practitioner, Felix and I met through our work. I first was introduced to Felix's work as a billboard on Sheridan Square in the anniversary of the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. Felix had made a public work there. And then a few years later, saw another billboard of a bed on my way to work in Soho. And then I started working in a foundation in Tribeca as the art preparator, and part of my job there was to install the work, and a couple of Felix's pieces were in the collection there. And so I got to know Felix from the outside in, through the actual handling of his work, and then finally meeting Felix as a person. And I think that the work functions for me very much in that approach, that there was an anonymous image that I can remember succinctly, the time of day it was, the time of year that I saw the images, that they galvanized and became very solid and connected to me. And I think experientially, they were functioning at the highest level of experience. The images, I guess, is thinking about Felix's work. I'm sorry, I'm just going to kind of ramble and probably get very confusing, and probably will have to be cut off because that's what I do. I don't want to make this too to emphasize the personal with Felix's work, because I think that it would lose an awful lot of the power and the importance of the practice, which was to transcend and to break down barriers of divisions. And there's a certain kind of politics of Felix, which were democratic, and a belief in his practice that we are all participating and that everyone has access or should have access. So there's an idealism that's built into the work, and also an investment in trust and in belief in all of us and in a future, that there will be participants who will agree to take on the challenge of the artist to continue. This aspect of the work is for me, part of the weight and the importance of the work is that it has a future that is beyond an artist's imagination. The finely tuned function of the art object beyond what an artist can control. This was exquisitely crafted into the concepts that Felix was working with, and a direct outcome from the kind of rigorous thought and attention to every detail that Felix gave his life and the things that he was working on, including his cats and his relationship with his friends and how he made a meal. I think that's about all I'm going to say. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you to Rosa and Carlos for bringing us all together. This is a little bit of a reunion for some of us because in many ways Felix brought us all together. And I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about Felix's relationship to other artists, because I'm actually not going to talk about that. I'm going off topic. But I did want to say one thing, is that Felix is the person who told me about Jim Hodges' work. So he was incredibly generous to other artists. And I remember Jim had a basement studio in that foundation. And Felix said, you got to go see this artist. He's making these webs out of chains. And I remember that studio visit still. So we had a very wonderful relationship to other younger artists and wanted to help them. But I thought I would actually talk with my institutional hat on, since I was a longtime curator and now in museums, and now a director of a museum. And everybody has been talking quite eloquently today about the relationship of Felix's work to the viewer, and the fact that the viewer really has a responsibility to finish the work. You all are participants in his work. But I think that nobody really thinks about the relationship between the work of art and the institution. So that's really what I'm going to talk about. Because as someone who has shown his work in several museums, it's a big responsibility. And so I'm going to be a little nerdy when it comes to certain things about installation practices and all of that. But again, it's all to sort of illuminate some of the things that people have been talking about today. So as I was preparing this talk, I was struck by the fact that the images that you see online of Felix's work are very Platonic. So I think of this as a very perfect installation shot of Felix's work, this beautiful 2 baby blue curtains called Untitled Lover Boy, and then the mirrored piece on the wall. It looks really placid and lovely. And so does this. And so I'm not going to assume that all of you in the audience know the intricacies of how his work works, so I will explain it. This is actually one of his light pieces, and of course the De La Cruzes have a beautiful piece downstairs. There are different light pieces. Some of them have only 1 string, some have 2, some have several. And when you get one of these works, you have to decide how you're going to install it. So again, this is a sort of beautiful, perfect, Platonic ideal of Felix's work. And then people become involved. This is a beaded curtain, so untitled gold, and it's actually a curtain made of beads, gold beads. Now, as you can see, if I showed it to you without the person in it, it would be, again, a Platonic ideal of a Félix González-Torres, but that is really not what the work is about. So you, as the viewer, are invited to go through the curtain. Now imagine what that relationship is like. You're going through the curtain, it's caressing your body, it's very, very intimate to the experience, and this is something that he very much thought about. Now here we go, another light piece. These light pieces are like hearths. When you put up a light piece, everyone goes to it. So the question is, when you're a curator like me, where do we put the light piece? You can hang it in any way that you want. It's a huge responsibility because you are being asked to be a co-author of the work. Someone earlier today mentioned that you got a lot of phone calls if you were, I think it was somebody, anyway, if you were installing a show, you had to call Felix and say, how do we do this? What height do you want the lights to be? All of that. So again, and he would say, whatever you want. That's very disconcerting if you're a museum person. Okay, another Platonic ideal. This is what it's like to install a candy piece. So for those of you, again, who don't know the work that well, there's a candy piece right down here. These are individual pieces of candy that are made by the Peerless Confection Company. Anybody who has ever done a Félix González-Torres show has Peerless Confection Company in their forehead. It's the one place that he wanted you to get the candy from. You had to order tons of it because nobody sells you enough candy for just one spill or one rectangle, let's say. So you order the candy and then you have to put it in a configuration. Sometimes he would tell you the configuration. Now that he's gone, it's up to you. Again, that's a huge responsibility. This is very much a part of his work. And then the viewer gets involved. So again, this is like with this piece, please, before you leave tonight, this is way too perfect. Each one of you has to take a candy piece. So the whole point of these candy pieces is that you take one. Think again about intimacy. You take one, you unwrap it, you put it in your mouth. You are ingesting a work of art. There is nothing more intimate than that. Now, think about it from a museum curator's point of view. How much candy do I have to order for a 3-month run of a show? That's something very real. The next question is, how perfect does it have to be? Do I have to make it perfect every night before I leave work? Or do you just let it go until there's very little left? Again, authorship is being transferred onto you. It's a very complicated relationship that you have. The next thing, and I'm going to be a little personal and tell you some anecdotes because it's interesting to hear how people really react to the work. There was a very important museum that did a show of Felix's work. And there was a candy piece made of bocce candy. You know bocce's? The best candy on earth. One of the guards ate so many bocce candies that she got sick. It's funny, but it's also about responsibility because part of what Felix was doing is putting the onus on you as a viewer. You have to control yourself. Felix was very generous, but he was also very tough. We talked about that. You have to take responsibility for your actions. This is very much tied to his ideas about democracy, which I'll get to in a minute. Another Platonic ideal. So here we have a perfect stack of papers. The way that these work is that you get a certificate which tells you you can print the stack, and this is the way it's going to look. This is the dimensions. There's an ideal height, but it's up to you when you want to replenish that height because you, as the viewer, get to take 1 or 2 or 3. So we all share in this responsibility. Now, if you're a museum curator, what you worry about is someone taking a piece from a stack, rolling it up, and all of a sudden you've got a weapon. So then what's the next question? Do you give people rubber bands? Do you get poster tubes? These are the things that you have to think about when you're showing a work of art in an institution, especially when you're showing a work like Felix's. None of this was accidental. He talked about all of this. So this is the messiest image that I could find on the net about how people interact with this work. But I have another story. A survey at the Guggenheim Museum, I think it was 95, 96, yeah. We all went to the opening. It's at the Guggenheim. It's a big deal. We're all decked out, watching all of this. It was like a feeding frenzy. People went insane, pulling stacks, candy. It was not the platonic ideal. It was absolutely insane. The next morning, I was talking to a friend, mutual friend of ours, another artist. Felix didn't say this to me. He said it to my friend. I will never forget this. I said, well, what did Felix think? It was kind of insane, all those people. And he said, you know what he said? These people can't handle democracy. Responsibility, politics was at the core of his work. He really meant it. All right, again, the viewer, participatory. This is a billboard. What do you think of when you see a billboard? Someone mentioned advertising. Carlos, you mentioned advertising today. He was certainly looking at the work of Barbara Kruger, advertising, all of that. This is a billboard with no image on it. It's a blank black screen so that you can actually project onto it. Again, very political work. Where do you put this? How do you deal with something like this if you're an institution? It's very complicated. Always good to end with sex. Look at the one on the right first. So when you first walked into the gallery, what you saw was this cube, essentially, a sculpture with lights. It looked like a Donald Judd, quite pure, reduced, you're waiting. All of a sudden, this man in underwear and a headphone, so headset, so it's private, he's listening to music privately, gets up and starts dancing on that cube. When I teach this to students, I call it sexing up minimalism. That's sort of what it is. It's very much about injecting the body, sensuality, all of that into his work. I never had to install this piece, but I do remember a conversation with Felix saying, you're the one who has to interview the dancer. Thank you.
I just saw some people giving out candy, so I thought I'd try to give a lecture, or not a lecture, a short talk while eating a candy of his. I think it's a bad idea, so I'm going to take it out. It tastes great. It's just not, it's not made for lectures. I was trying to think about how to frame his work. Sergio and I had lunch a few weeks ago, and we were talking about Felix's work. He's somebody that I studied pretty intensely, actually, when I was writing my PhD as an art historian in London. And it's interesting to look at his work both through an academic lens, which is my background, but also through a lens of somebody that's working in the market now. And it's interesting. He passed away in '96, and really his body of work is pretty densely concentrated from the late '80s to the mid '90s, which is an interesting moment if you study the market, which is what I've spent my career doing to date and the world that I operate in. Art Basel Miami was founded in 2001, 2002, depending where you date it exactly. And Felix passed away 5 years before that. The market, as we've come to know it really in the time since, is very different than it was when he was working. So I really think of Felix as this fascinating artist who actually occupied this bridge between two moments in our field in a way. On the one hand, there's a direct lineage conceptually and formally, I think, to an earlier generation of artists, a lot of whom have been discussed today. People like Lawrence Weiner, Donald Judd, early first-generation conceptualists who his work very directly references and grows out of. On the other hand, there's a whole other generation of artists, which I'll loosely frame under the relational aesthetics generation, who Felix was kind of associated with, but not really. But really who are the current generation who are now in vogue. And so I look at Felix from the perspective of art history, but also from the market as really creating this bridge between these two different worlds. And I think that's actually really interesting, that you can have a legacy that kind of straddles both of these spheres from a market. In the 80s, there was very specific context that he was working in. The market crashed, and a new generation of artists with whom he was very closely associated really came to the fore, whose practices were much more relational, were much more deeply political. And they had been on the margins of the market at the time in the 80s and early 90s. But in the absence of much of a commercial structure in the art world at the time, a whole new generation of galleries came to the fore. Andrea Rosen, who's been Felix's gallerist for 25 years now, she actually opened her gallery with the show of Felix. And I think that's pretty meaningful, actually, in the context of where I sit and where everybody here sits. And it's very fascinating to me. There's a digital generation of artists that are working now whose work deals with file sharing, referencing, indexing, copying. And Felix, also sort of predated this internet moment. And the internet was really founded in '89, didn't really come into its own in terms of a practice that artists were regularly using until really the end of his career, and in many ways much more recently. And I try to ask the question of what would Felix be doing if he was working today. And I think somehow, although the form of his work might have remained constant, there would be some relationship with the internet and a lot of different sort of, I wouldn't call them democratic platforms, but platforms for sharing and exchanging ideas and information. So it's one interesting way of perhaps reframing where Felix would be today if he was around now. I think there's a lot of artists that are influenced and interested in his career. And what's interesting in the context, I think, of our panel here today is how many different sort of lines are drawn through Felix's career. So I sort of mapped some of them out as I was just standing here. I was thinking back, actually, I remember listening to a lecture, and I don't know what came of it, but Hal Foster, when I was at the Courtauld, gave this lecture about Richter. And he asked the question as to why Richter is so popular and such a canonical artist. And he basically said, if I'm interpreting him or remembering him correctly, that Richter was an important artist because his career or what he works with or what he creates is somehow meaningful to different types of people. So if you're a formalist art historian, you can relate to the work because it's quite beautiful and it traces a real aesthetic history. But of course, if you're also interested in politics of the 60s and 70s, there's a density to what Richter is doing, which is also interesting from a totally different standpoint. And in thinking about Felix's work in the context of our conference, I think that's exactly it, actually. I think different people can take different aspects of his work, or different artists can be influenced or regurgitate the work in different ways, but nobody's really getting at the thing itself, because Felix's work, it was bringing together so many different fields in a way. On the one hand, there are aesthetic concerns, right? The work is beautiful, it's attractive, it's sexy. So there's an aesthetic history that you can trace through his work. There's a formal history, obviously, through minimalism. There's a political history. He's very much an artist of the moment, the late 80s. The context that he was working in was very specific, very different to now, but also similar in a way. There's an intellectual property and a legal formation that a lot of people have touched on today. So if you're a legal scholar or a scholar of intellectual property, you can access his work and think about his work through that way. But if you only do that, you're not really getting to the center of it. There's a market relationship, which is sort of my interest, but I think Felix is great for me because there's a market relationship in terms of how he thinks about uniqueness and editioning and how the work transmits itself through the economy of what we work with, but it goes beyond that as well. Jim mentioned the word trust, and I think actually maybe that gets to the heart of it, that somehow in this all, there's a fundamental relationship between the artist and the different constituents that ultimately embody the work that's really essential. The financial markets, of course, are also based on trust fundamentally. A dollar, a currency, all these things doesn't really mean anything. It's only as good as the faith in the system itself. And maybe that's what's most perhaps incredible about his work. I think in a market and an environment like we're living in nowadays, which so much volatility, so many different things happen, getting back to that essential nature of trust and relationships is something that I think continues to come through the work. And in the end, I think the art market, although people try to make it larger than it is or try to make it seem like some kind of crazy artificial mechanism, really is built on relationships. We had a nice dinner last night with a gentleman who's a big entrepreneur and has built and developed a lot of different businesses, and I asked him sort of what, if there was one lesson that he had to impart in what he did, what would it be? And he basically just said, hire great people. You know, it's basically, all we do is basically based on relationships and people. And I think the essence of what Felix has created and the legacy that he leaves for us here and for artists that are working nowadays is that what you create is not a static good, you know, that it has a relationship to the context in which it's exhibited and the people that interact with it. So for me, sort of straddling these ways in a similar way perhaps that he straddled his own career, I mean, I think that's what's left. And if we take anything out of today, I think that's an important lesson, that relationships, trust in the work, and belief that it's, you know, that it holds something higher than the thing itself is what really is left with it. So I'm not going to say any more, but yeah, he's somebody that's very important for me, and I'm really glad to actually be here today. So.
Candy has become almost sacramental. I didn't want to take that away. You know, I could be blamed for some things, but not that. Okay, great. And there should be a little implement for showing slides. It's under here. Okay, my name is Robert Hobbs, you can see right there. And rather than talking about people who've been influenced by Felix, there have been loads of people influenced by Felix. What occurred to me when I was asked to participate in this symposium is that I should really look through a lot of material on Félix González-Torres. And I found that one of the ideas that I felt would have been basic and fundamental for people to discuss in relationship to Felix's work is Robert Smithson. Now, maybe I have a warped view of Robert Smithson. I should tell you that I did the first retrospective exhibition of Smithson, and it traveled around the US and Europe, and I did the Cornell University Press book, and I've thought a lot about Smithson because his wife, Nancy Holt, a really wonderful artist, has asked me to go back and rethink it, meaning to add 5 pieces of sculpture, so it'll be a catalog raisonné. So I started looking at Felix's work, and I thought, people are going to be talking about Smithson. Of course they are. But no. He's barely mentioned, and it seems to me this is a real opportunity to think about Félix González-Torres' work in another way, and also to think about Smithson's. Because there are a lot of commonalities. For those of you who were here this morning, you could have heard this wonderful series of statements by Jim. Everything he was saying was poetry, and I had to stop him. I'm still sorry about that. But he talked about Felix as a post-studio artist. What this means is he didn't have a studio. Smithson was a post-studio artist. They were really very much interested in art as a way of thinking. And Felix belonged to, it's Common Ground, isn't it? I always get it, Jim. Common Ground? What is, yeah, okay, I always get the group mixed up. Julie Alt, if you get a hold of her book, she was a member. Pardon? I knew I was wrong. Yeah, okay, we were both wrong. Group material, all right. They were a really wonderful group who felt art and politics are important. And they would go out in communities where people weren't necessarily looking at art. They would invite them to come into storefront spaces to talk about objects that were important to them. Not saying it had to be art, but objects that were important, and discuss it. They also did a lot of very good reading, and they were very much interested in Lay. And Robert Smithson worked at a bookstore at St. Mark's Place, where they prided themselves on having the very latest books in any field, and he didn't have a college degree, so he tried to make up for it by reading. And I remember doing a panel like this at the Whitney Museum of American Art, and Richard Serra was one of the people, and I said, well, I've asked people to talk for 5 or 10 minutes, and he said, well, I didn't get your letter. I said, we'll pass over you. No one passes over Richard Serra, believe me. He was so brilliant, and he talked about how Smithson would play games with people with knowledge that he had. The point I want to make is both of these artists took great pride in the knowledge they had, in the reading, and they were both working strongly within traditions. And they're really brilliant traditions, and I think they worked in traditions together. in terms of some of the same traditions. For example, the whole idea of dual perspectives. First of all, let me say that in terms of the biographies of both artists, there's a certain similarity. One, of course, we know the story about Félix González-Torres in terms of losing his partner, Ross, and also being diagnosed AIDS positive, HIV positive. Smithson was a replacement child. His older brother had died before he was born. The parents wanted to have another child. He was doted on like crazy. He had his mother and his aunt. And there is something about presence and absence and also looking from two different points of view. Maybe I identify this more than other people because my mother dressed my brother, who was 2 years older than me, and me like twins for the first 10 years. She thought it was really cute, and it was cute. But it was terrible for my brother. But this idea of looking from different, it was great for me. I was older than, I was bigger than my age, and he was a little smaller, so they'd say, oh, were you the oldest? Anyway. The thing about it is looking from two different points of view. And so the chandeliers here come from a trip to LA when he and Ross were having a particularly good time, and in the hotel they saw this chandeliers, and he took it from two different points of view. Smithson's in antiomorphic chambers. Enantiomorphic is a nice sort of term for crystals that grow in opposite directions, and it has been rebuilt. It was lost for some reason, and it happens to be this mirrored configuration, so when you start looking, it breaks up this binocular stereoscopic vision we have, so you see a blind spot in the center. And so this idea of breaking up vision and looking at it, you see how vision functions by seeing how it doesn't function. So I would say both are very much cyberneticist in terms of looking very much at how a system functions or breaks down. The whole idea of appropriation, material is meaning, is very important. Appropriation is a very nice term that's been bantered around for decades. It takes the idea of artistic influence, which is seen as passive and negative, and an artist sort of passively waits there until some brilliant forebearer influences them. And that's not appropriation. Appropriation is where artists grab and take hold of an influence and change it and develop it. Félix González-Torres said he wanted to be like a virus, that he went inside the tradition and changed it. He didn't want to be known as a minority artist. He didn't necessarily want to be known as a gay artist, and he certainly didn't want to be known as an AIDS victim. And what I'm showing here is his piece, Placebo, and placebo is this idea that, it's a sugar pill. It doesn't work as a kind of drug, and it's made with this candy, and it's a great piece, and you showed Amada the installation of this same work. But if you think about this in relationship to the Cornell rock salt piece by Robert Smithson, you start thinking about the crystalline structure of Smithson's, non-crystalline. There's enough that one looks like another, and they start to change each other, and it's like Félix González-Torres appropriates Smithson, I've done work on Motherwell too, but he changes Smithson, and so we see Smithson himself differently. There's a whole idea of the art of late coming, where the late coming artist changes the earlier one, so you start thinking, well, it's candy. Candy can be sacramental. Rob Storr says it's very sexual. He even uses the word fellatio, which I would never use in relationship to it. I think it has to do with, I didn't use it. I sound like Trump, don't I? The whole idea here is that it's candy and it's sacramental, but Félix González-Torres was not religious, so it's like a secular kind of ritual of taking the candy, and I love the fact that you were taking the candy and sharing it with others just now. And Smithson took rock salt for under Cayuga Lake, and it had a whole sort of science fictional quality, but it suddenly changes Smithson's piece into foodstuffs, and we start thinking about it very, very differently because of González-Torres. This is one of the things that I just felt like was always Smithson and González-Torres. Again, appropriation. This portrait of Marcel Brion, he's a very famous collector in Paris. It's a really beautiful piece. And you start asking questions like, if it's a corner piece, and who does corner pieces? And Smithson did it like this wonderful piece with the red sandstone. One is artificial commercial candy. The other is rock salt. Smithson has mirrors around it, so the piece itself is 1/4 real and 3/4 illusion. And it's like the denial of that on the part of Félix González-Torres is really quite fascinating. The whole idea of entropy. Entropy was very important in the 1960s. There are two definitions of it. The first one comes from the second law of thermodynamics, that energy can be neither created nor destroyed. It's channeled into unavailable states, so all of the planet Earth would look like maybe Mars or something else like this vast desert. But there's another definition of entropy that is information overload. It's a kind of exhilaration of just being overloaded with information, and the imagination turns off, and one has a sense of excitation from it. Smithson's piece is this very small heap of language where he uses words starting with the top language, and then he finds all of the synonyms he can find for a language, ending up with hieroglyphics on the bottom. Félix González-Torres stacks are information. It may not have words on this, it may have a border, but it is information. And the fact that it's taken piece after piece, this image of generosity, an image of fecundity, the image of the idea that it is a kind of little bit of infinity, of giving you a glimpse of infinity, I think is really quite exciting. And I think for me, I get the exhilaration of entropy as information overload. The whole idea of art as a kind of box, a container for something, it goes back to even Renaissance and perhaps for even earlier. Maybe it even goes back to the Old Testament, with the whole idea that you took the deity, Yahweh or whatever, was in the sacred element. And Panofsky, the great art historian who wrote about Renaissance art, talked about secreting ideas in a work of art. The work of art is a repository. And what Smithson does is plays with this in terms of presence and absence and public and private. And his piece there happens to be this container that he built, and it has this material from Mono Lake in the southwest. And then it has the map above it, and the map is empty in the center. The Felix, untitled here, is a contract he made with a collector whereby he would send information. The collector bought the box and got the things. And it can only be shown by slides or reproduction. It is not to be shown in an exhibit publicly. So this idea of an art that contains something secreted away, what is private, what is public, begins to be an interesting question for both of them. The idea of presence and absence, and this is that great piece that I thought I was showing this morning. I had moved it to here. Somewhere better than this, no place better than this. It's very much like Smithson's sight, non-sight. So Smithson becomes interested in the whole idea of the epistemology of art. What I'm referring to is the idea of what kind of knowledge does art present? And he says with sculpture, it presents something here, but it's always referencing something outside of itself. So what you see with this Palisades, Edgewater, New Jersey non-site in the Whitney's collection is trap rock from a system that is broken down because it's a no longer relevant or no longer used trolley system. And over on the right, the little framed part is a map for it. And what Félix González-Torres does with a fabulous piece back here is he breaks up the work into presence and absence. So there's a dialectic. And I think one of the things that's interesting, you don't see it with this one, but with a lot of his titles, they're untitled. Untitled with quotation marks around them, what I understand from the foundation. And then he will put in parentheses some sort of elusive title, like placebo that I showed you. That sets up a kind of dialectic, a to and froing, that is very much like Smithson's sight, non-sight. You saw earlier today, people talked about this incredible parquet billboard with really, it's indexical piece showing footsteps on sand. Someone has been there. There's something missing. Smithson's piece is a piece he did for Art Forum called Incidents of Mirror Travel in the Yucatan. And he took 9 pieces of mirrors and he wrote about them. And I think this is the piece why I got interested in Smithson, because I didn't understand it. It's really mythic and fabulous and wonderful. But the mirrors were taken, they were photographed, then they were moved. So the whole idea, the work of art dealing with traces, something that is not there, something that is gone, something that is absent, something that plays on traces, as with this, is important. So basically what I'm suggesting are a few ideas between Smithson, Félix González-Torres. Since looking at this, it's becoming part of a bigger project, so I just wanted to give you a sample of some of the ideas that I'm thinking about. Thank you. Let me get my water.
Sure. We have a few minutes. If anybody has any questions for the panelists, we could probably take one or two questions. No questions. Oh, then I will leave you with this thought. Amada mentioned earlier that everybody should take a piece of candy on their way out. But I would also encourage you to thank Felix for his work and his memories and his legacy for today, but also to thank Rosa and Carlos for this place that they have created, that there's nowhere better than this place.
Thank you very much for coming on behalf of Rosa and myself and the staff, the director, Yvette, of our museum here. It's always gratifying to see so many people interested in what we're doing, and it was a real pleasure working with Eduardo, who came up with this idea when he first saw Felix's work, which shows the impact that Felix's work can have. The symposium today, the whole day was extremely interesting, and I want to have Eduardo say a few words.
Thank you. I want to thank the participants for joining us here. It's really been a privilege to hear your thoughts, and I want to thank Sergio, who really brought everyone together. I mean, the conference really could not have happened without his networks, the people that he knows, and his ability to really, he embodies this intersection of art and law. He's one of our graduates, graduate of Cornell Law School and an artist, and so straddles both worlds. Also Yvette and Christine Hoffmeister. I don't know where, Yvette, thank you for your work. And then finally, Carlos and Rosa for inspiring this event, for participating in the event earlier, and for hosting us in this space, to be here talking about the work of Félix González-Torres and surrounded by the work and pointing to it throughout the day was such a privilege, and then it's just such a beautiful space. So we're very grateful to you for that. And for the audience, thank you for coming, because we've heard again multiple times today that his work is completed by the audience, and it's true of academics as well. We're often used to speaking to nobody. And so it's a privilege to have an audience. And so thank you so much for coming tonight.